Now then, with the crankcase back together and the engine on the stand, I can get started on the stuff that goes on the left and the right hand side of the engine. So on the right hand side, that's the auxiliary chain, those sprockets and the clutch. And on the left hand side, it's that cover and sorting out all the seals and bearings that go in that cover that hides the gear change mechanism. So I think I'll start there. I laid everything out on the bench and began replacing the bearings and seals. First up was the clutch pushrod seal, which pushed in nicely. Then I got the new bearing for the gear selector shaft and tapped that down into the bore using a deep socket. With the bearing all the way in, I pressed the dust seal in over the top. Turning it over, I started to fit the output shaft seal. It has to go in from the inside as it sits up against this lip. After a good push, it was all the way in and everything looked good. Next up, I changed the O-ring on the solid dowel, and then I fitted both dowels into their homes in the crankcase. I dug out the bolts and gave them a clean, then I made sure I knew where they all went. But the countersunk screws were a little bit corroded. I checked my stock, and as it happened I had the right size, so I gave them a little side-by-side test. Two problems. They're posi drive instead of JIS heads, which would make Shozo Kawasaki turn in his grave, but also the heads were a tad smaller, meaning they sat deeper in the countersunk holes than the original. I'm afraid this just won't do. So I took the original bolts, cleaned them up on the wire wheel, fresh zinc plating, and we're good to go. I lubed up the shafts with clean engine oil, being sure to give all the working parts a good coating of oil so they won't dry, and then applied a smear of Free Bond to the seam area where the crankcase halves join. I hung the new gasket on the dowels and offered up the cover to the shafts, being careful not to damage the seals as it went on. With some gentle taps with the old rubber convincing tool to see it all the way home, I started threading in the bolts. With thread lock on the screws and the bolts torqued up, the left side is now ready for the rest once it's back in the frame. Moving to the right side, the alternator drive sprocket went on the shaft, followed by the circlip. After I checked it was properly in, I slotted the chain guide onto the shelf in the casing and lined it up with the oil gallery at the top. This is where it's held in place by the oil spray bar assembly, so that went in next. With that torqued up, I fitted the chain over the top sprocket, then wriggled the oil pump sprocket into place, engaging the chain at the same time. With the circlip fully in, I fit the spacer over the output shaft, followed by the needle roller bearing and sprocket. Sliding the bearing and spacer out a little bit helps engage the chain. So with that in, I slid that back together and gave it all a little quick spin. Looks good. The upper chain adjuster was next. There's a bit of a sequence to this, where you fit the bolts in dry, you nip them up, and then back them off again, just enough to allow the tension of the steel move. The chain tension is then set before the lower adjuster goes on, by threading out the bolt until the slack is completely removed from the bottom section of chain. Then you tighten the lock nut, Remove the pivot bolt, which is the top one, apply thread lock and then tighten it up. Then you remove the bottom bolt, thread lock, tighten up, then torque them both up to spec. I reset the bottom adjuster and fitted it into its location, being careful that the plunger doesn't plunge all the way out in the process. Similar story with the bolts, one by one, using thread lock and torquing to spec. I gave everything a quick spin to test for any tight spots, but all rotated smoothly. But something worried me slightly. The deformation of the chain on the top tensioner seemed excessive, and even though it measured in spec when I checked it, I thought I'd check the price of a new one. There we are. 25 quid. No brainer, mate. Only available on back order though, so let's fast forward a week, and hey, it's already here. Looking at the difference, I'm happy I replaced it. Clutch time, boys and girls. I lined up the outer basket with the pins on the sprocket, oiled the kneader roller bearing and slid it into its home. I got replacements for the two broken bolts that fix it to the sprocket, applied thread lock and torqued them up. I put the big washer on next, and then slid the clutch centre onto the splines of the input shaft. The spline spacer goes on here, with the oil grooves facing inwards. Then the inner basket, making sure the back torque limiter cams went in the right places on the other side. I started fitting the back torque limiter return springs, and then I noticed that one had a broken locating tab. Well, this just won't do. Back on foul as I go. Well, they're nice and cheap, but it's a modified part, so I'll need two. And what's that? Back order again. Okay, see you in a week. You can see why these videos can take a while to come out, right? I fitted both the new springs in, overlapping them so that the tabs went into alternating slots on the inner basket. Then I fitted a new centre nut. You can see these are slightly squished in on three sides on the outer few threads, which gives a sort of locking function. This is why you need a new one every time. I used the holding tool to get a firm grip of the basket, took a 36mm socket to the nut and gave it everything I had to torque it up to spec. I know a lot of people use ooga dooga guns on these, but considering this is my first time, I'm just going to go by the book. I had new friction plates waiting patiently in oil while I've been sorting the side of the engine, so they're well and truly impregnated. Thus began the process of alternating a steel plate and a friction plate to create the stack. The final friction plate's tabs sit in the other set of slots to the rest. I gave the clutch rod a good rub of grease and inserted it through the input shaft and out through the seal on the other side. The manual calls for a blob of grease on the end and on the release bearing, so I did that and then fitted the pressure plate followed by the new springs. I tightened the spring bolts evenly, working around in a star pattern, and then torqued them up to spec. You know you're getting close when you're putting the dowels in. Another smear of free bond on the seams, and then I fitted the new gasket. I'd replaced all those horrible gold bolts with new silver ones, and worked my way around threading them in hand tight. Of course, not forgetting to add the cable bracket for the feed from the pickup. The front 2 bolts either side of the case seam are the only 2 that require thread lock, so I did those 2 last, then I torqued them all up to spec in a crisscross pattern. Ooh, it's getting there. And now that I can hold the clutch still, I can finally fit the coupler for the alternator. So I popped that onto the splines of the shaft and bolted it up to spec with thread lock. Moving up, I put the gasket and the crankcase breather cover on top and threaded in the 4 bolts. So here we are, it's really coming together. Both the right hand side and the left are all together, and the breather cover's on. I'm going to leave the sump until it's back in the frame. I'll do the oil cooler and the filter then too. So it's time to start working upwards. I've got new piston rings on order, because after a bit of deliberation, I can't think of any reason not to change them. So I've got everything laid out ready to go, which means in the next video I can bust out the spring compressor, and I can get the pistons in, and get the cylinders on, and I can get the head on. See you then.